to address our thoughts, if I may, today to the psalm that we just read together, Psalm 99. But before I specifically look at the psalm, I want to make one or two observations about the way in which we read the Old Testament scriptures. Can I suggest to you that we have a tendency to read the Old Testament through the eyes of the Pharisees? Now, I don't think that's a particularly smart move, because Jesus condemned the way in which the Pharisees read and interpreted the Old Testament. And so if Jesus thought it was not a smart move, I suggest it isn't. But we do tend to read the Old Testament as though it's a testimony to a failed and a nationalistic faith. Failed because it taught God's people under the Old Testament that they were to live righteously, and if they failed, God would condemn them. Unfortunately, of course, no one can live up to those standards, and therefore it was necessary for God to come up with a super plan to overcome his first plan for people to find their way back to him. And of course that plan anyway was located within one particular nation. So when we come to the New Testament, we're introduced to God's successful plan after his failure in the Old Testament. Now, the fact that Jesus warns us that that's not the right way to do it ought to give us pause for thought. In fact, if we read the Old Testament scriptures, we find that our first parents got the world as we know it into a mess, that we inherit that mess, both in terms of the fact that we inherit the consequences, but we are also in some way indwelt by the same rebellious spirit that inhabited them, and it required therefore God to intervene. And he intervened in grace. He intervened in grace by choosing Abraham and his descendants to be the means by which the world would find its way back to God. I'm glad we sang the first hymn we did this morning, Jesus shall reign where'er the sun does his successive journeys run, captures that idea that God's plan from the beginning was that the earth would be filled again with the glory of God, like the waters cover the sea. And he chose Abraham's descendants and focused in ultimately upon one of those descendants. But in his dealings with Israel, his dealings were always dealings of grace. So when he gave Moses the law, it wasn't the standard by which people might find their way back to God. It was the standard of kingdom life. It was given to people whom he had already redeemed. And he now says, now you're my people, this is how I expect you to live. Now, when we read the Old Testament in that light, we see its story is a story consistent with where we are too. The difference simply being that whereas they looked forward to God's deliverer, we look back to the work that the Lord Jesus Christ undertook. But because we fail to read the Old Testament that way, and incidentally that's 79% of the Bible, it's why actually we tend not to read the Old Testament. We've misunderstood the plot. We've lost the plot, I might suggest to you. But if what I've just shared with you is right, then it makes sense of Psalm 99. Now, Psalm 99 comes in the midst of a succession of psalms running from 62 to 100, which are specifically concerned with God as king, as the king who, for example, here in verse 1 is celebrated. The Lord reigns, let the nations tremble. Now, when it refers there to the Lord reigning, it doesn't simply mean that he's a constitutional monarch who's tucked away in a palace somewhere and does little or nothing for the job that is given to him. It conveys the idea that here is one who is active. He rules, the Lord rules. But notice the following. The Lord rules, so let the nations tremble. He sits enthroned between the cherubim. Let the earth shake. Great is the Lord in Zion. He is exalted over all the nations. Let them praise your great and awesome name. He is holy. So those first two verses in Psalm 99 reflect the calling of God's people to be a light to the nations, that God's purpose is that the world will yet be filled with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. That's his plan, because he is the Lord, the King. And he is holy. It's interesting to look at verses 4 and 5. The King is mighty, he loves justice. You have established equity in Jacob. You've done what is just and right. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. He is holy. Words tumble out of the psalmist's mouth at this point. Words which refer to both the inner and outer character of God. His inner integrity, his outward acts. He loves justice and he's established equity. And not only so, but this is not merely something that is said as a creed. It is something that God's people can declare as something that is true for them. In Jacob, you have done what is just and right. And so on the basis of their experience of God, the psalmist invites all the nations to exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. He is holy. I was reflecting on that this morning. We sometimes sing that old hymn, don't we? Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. And I think what the psalmist is doing here is saying, the Lord reigns. He rules. And the Lord I'm talking about is this Lord who is beautiful in his holiness, utterly upright, one of utter integrity, the sort of God in whom we can trust and find our delight. But what does it mean to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness? Well, I think verses 6 and 7 of our psalm help us to understand that. Moses and Aaron were among his priests. Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called on the Lord and he answered them. He spoke to them from the pillar of cloud. They kept his statutes and the decrees he gave them. I sometimes think we complicate our understanding of prayer. What is prayer? Well, here's my definition, and it works for me. Prayer is conversing with God. Prayer is conversing with God. My speaking to him speaking to me, and I suppose there's more to it than that. There are those occasions when, because we've got to know one another, then we don't need to exchange words. We can just, like an old married couple, sit there and enjoy one another's presence. But prayer is simply meeting with God and chatting with him. Isn't that what we have here? He spoke to them from the pillar of cloud. That was the symbol of his presence in the Old Testament. When the cloud was there, God was present. And when they were there in the midst of the cloud, they called on him. They cried out to him. They spoke to him, and he answered them. And the result of that relationship of love, as they celebrate, as God's people celebrated the beauty of his holiness, and as he entered into fellowship with them and cherished them, is that they kept his statutes and the decrees he gave them. I once wrote a book on the book of Exodus, and it was entitled Freed to Serve. The thing about a relationship of love, is that those things that our loved one asks of us, we're willing to do. We're delighted to do them. And sometimes, we do things for our loved ones that we would never normally do for anyone else. I have grandchildren, and we are currently sometimes called upon to do some fairly messy tasks. But we do them, and we do them with a degree of pleasure, if you can use that word, because it's our grandchildren. We love them. And because Moses and Aaron and Samuel loved the Lord in the beauty of his holiness, then they love to do what he called them to do. Brothers and sisters, the measure of our love for God is the degree to which we cherish those things that he calls upon us to do, even those things that are difficult and hard. So to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness, to worship at his footstool because he is holy, is seen in that intimacy in which we enter into fellowship with him, talk to him, he talks to us, and we freely undertake to perform those things he calls us to do. But notice finally the last couple of verses. Lord, our God, you answered them, but then comes the rub. You were to Israel a forgiving God, though you punished their misdeeds. There is the recognition in this verse that those who gathered in the fellowship of God gathered as those who were sinners who needed the forgiveness of God. They were always dependent upon the forgiveness of God. They were always dependent on his grace. Sometimes they suffered the consequences of what they had done, but God forgave them. He is a forgiving God. Now, of course, they did not have the light that we have, the light that's been revealed to us in the Lord Jesus Christ, who has shown how it is possible for God to forgive. Under the Old Testament, it was by means of types and shadows and sacrifices. For us, it is that forgiveness is possible because of what the Lord Jesus Christ did for us. So, what does it look like to serve the Lord? How should we serve him and worship him? Well, we should worship him out of love for what he has done for us, for the grace that he has shown to us. We should above all do so because he has forgiven us in the Lord Jesus Christ. And we should enter into that fellowship with him that delights in him, that delights to follow his path and honour his ways. And we should long, as the psalmist did, to see the earth filled with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. We are a missionary people. We're called to show forth the light of the glory of God. We can do that, most of us, only in our little corner. But we can, by worshipping the Lord in the beauty of holiness, be those who bear testimony to a world in need. And so the psalmist concludes, exalt the Lord our God, worship him at his holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holy. So that's the challenge, brother and sister, to us today as we reflect upon this psalm, to get to know our God better, to delight in all that he is and all that he's proven himself to be, and by means of that deepening fellowship with him, be people who are more able by the very lives that we live, as much as the words that we say, to bear testimony to a lost world that this God is their God, and he invites them into fellowship with himself.